Since mid-April in Ontario, students from kindergarten to grade 12 have been learning online only. If they should return back to the classroom has been hotly debated on all sides throughout the third wave of COVID-19. We heard finally this week that kids will finish the school year learning from home, not back in person. With us now for the details, both in Ontario's capital city, Caroline Alphonso, education reporter for the Global Mail, and Kristin Rushowy, Queen's Park reporter with a focus on education at the Toronto Star. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having us.
Hi, thanks for having us.
So this was the announcement that a lot of parents have been waiting for since April. I wanted to start our discussion first by showing the Premier's announcement on schools from this past Wednesday.
So today, I have to announce that schools will not be returning for in-class learning until the fall. I know this is difficult, very difficult news. It was a hard choice to make, but I will not, and I repeat, I will not take unnecessary risks with our children right now. The fact is, we're fighting a third wave driven by variants. And unlike the original strains, we know that some of the variants we're fighting right now are more dangerous for children.
I wanted to get both of your reactions from the Premier's announcement. Caroline, I'll start with you first.
I think, every parent across this province has been waiting for that announcement. Kids have been home since mid-April. I speak not only as the education reporter, but as a parent myself. I have two children who have been learning online since April. And, for some kids, it's been fine. They don't mind it. But I've heard from many, many parents that it's been really difficult for children to be at home, to be learning online every day. And I think, there was this hope among many that kids could return to the classroom, as they have in most other provinces, could return to the classroom for the month of June, not for really the academic side, but more for the social aspect of things. I know my kids are dying to see their friends and dying to see their teachers. And I think there was this anticipation that at least regionally that would happen, that kids in Thunder Bay and Kingston and Ottawa outside of the GTA could be back in school. So I think there was just some disappointment there.
We're going to talk about some of the reasons why the government says they made the decision that they made. But a lot of people, there's been, discussion around it's only a few weeks. It's not that big of a deal. Kristin, what was your reaction to the Premier's announcement that children will not be returning to in-person learning?
I think some people were surprised. I mean, last week we had the Premier ask for consensus. He reached out to public health units. He reached out to teacher unions. He heard from all of them. He heard from experts. He heard from Sick Kids Hospital, Children's Hospital in Eastern Ontario, the Canadian Pediatric Society. Everybody said, you know what, we support reopenings. Regionally, probably, given, low case numbers in places like Kingston and Thunder Bay, as Caroline mentioned. So there was a broad consensus. He did have support. And then at the end of the day, there were also whispers in his ear from business. He was worried about the economy. He was worried about the variants. He'd also heard from hospital CEOs who said, you know what, numbers are coming down, but the ICUs are still under pressure. And we're worried that if there is an increase in cases, that we might be swamped again. And, the science table had predicted a 6 to 11% increase in cases should all kids return to school. They felt it was manageable, but it was just a risk the Premier said he didn't want to take. And he didn't want to risk the reopening this summer.
You mentioned the letter that the Premier sent, I think it was 2 weeks ago. And myself, with my children, I've been telling them that they're not going back to school since April. I just didn't want to disappoint them. It's better, I guess, for me, in my mind, it's better for them to be surprised. And Caroline, Dr. David Williams, the Chief Medical Officer, the Science Table, and many others, as Kristin has mentioned, they supported a reopening on a regional basis. Why is the government choosing a different path?
Yes, you're right. It's surprising that so many people, the broad consensus for a regional opening happened, even with the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation. The president there said a regional opening. The Premier's message was he sent this letter out to get a consensus. He got a consensus around a regional opening, but he said there were no guarantees that, we wouldn't see an increase in the number of cases by, I think he said, many, many thousands or thousands and thousands. So that's why they took a different path. They, there's whispers that the premier wants the economy to open or go into stage 1 here. And so, 3 weeks of school, some people think doesn't make a huge difference in the lives of kids to be home learning. Maybe a September start would be better. They can return to somewhat, hopefully, a normal school year. So that's the path that they decided to choose.
It just kind of feels like deja vu. We've been here before. We kind of heard the same story last May when we were told that schools were going to be closed indefinitely so that we could get ready for September. And Kristin, in that same press conference, Premier Ford that his government would use this extra time to get students and teachers vaccinated and also to invest in ventilation in schools. To what extent were they doing that before?
Well, certainly there's been money provided to school boards, and there was last summer for them to improve things like ventilation and things like that and upgrade windows, because we did hear from a lot of teachers who said, look, there are limiters on my window. I can't even open them more than a couple of inches. So the boards did do what they could over the summer. I mean, the Toronto District School Board said quite clearly, yes, we've got the money for ventilation, but, in order to procure it and to actually get it in place, this takes months. So, they did what they could. I think a lot of, sort of portable air filters and things like that. The federal and provincial governments have both ponied up some more money for this fall to, again, improve ventilation. So we should see some more work on that over this summer. I think we're also expecting to see cohorting. The province has talked about that. So keeping kids within a certain group and limiting their contacts. And I think we will also see still physical distancing and also masking when they return in the fall.
Now, during the press conference, the premier said that he had a conversation with a young Ontarian, and this young man wanted to have outdoor graduation ceremonies. Caroline, how were school boards reacting to this, that the premier is suggesting that boards have outdoor ceremonies?
I think there was a lot of frustration when school boards heard about this. Many of them, have been changing tactics all along. If the government announces something, they have to rejig their school calendars. They have to rejig cohorts, things like that. So this is sort of for them one more thing to have to deal with when we're so close to the end of the year. And now many school boards had already planned virtual graduation ceremonies as they had last spring. And so the plan was in the works. They had engaged students, they had engaged teachers in that. And I think there's a lot of frustration that, how do we do that? How do we do that when we have restrictions in place on how many people can gather outside? What if the weather changes and we have a graduation ceremony outside? What do we do in that case? How many people can we invite? So my sense is that, there was a press release from the Thames Valley School Board in London, Ontario yesterday that said, we are going to go ahead with our virtual graduation ceremonies, and we will wait for direction from the government on how to hold these in-person outdoor graduation ceremonies. So I think the sentiment right now is like, we're going to go ahead and we'll see what the government decides. We don't really have that much time to do it in, so who knows what's going to happen there.
Yeah, it seems kind of confusing because we still have outdoor restrictions. And Kristin, not to put you on the spot at all, but the Toronto Star, the Star editorial board, had this to say in the Toronto Star. Ford should just level with students because of all his previous poor choices. He had to weigh their lives and futures against those of restaurants, bars, and small businesses, and they didn't come out on top. Every parent knows the fastest way to lose a child's trust is to mislead them. Perhaps Ford is banking on voters being more lenient or hoping that after a summer of patios, they won't remember the price students paid. Kristin, is the government putting the economy ahead of schools?
I think what the premier did was sort of weigh what was more important. And I think what they were hearing certainly in polling, I mean, Colin DeMello at CTV News was reporting on polling that showed there wasn't a huge amount of support for reopening schools if it was going to delay reopening the economy. So they didn't even, voters didn't even approve a week's delay. So I think the premier weighed that against, the threat of the variant, more cases, slowing down the economy, people not having a good summer, right? Everyone's pandemic weary. Kids are looking forward to going to camp. People are looking forward to having, maybe less restrictions this summer. So yes, it was a political decision, and I think too, they looked at the numbers, and in terms of elementary school parents, I think it was about 15% of the population. And they said yes, well, children's mental health is important. Everybody's mental health is important, and everyone's mental health is served by opening up the economy and returning to as normal as we can, as soon as we can.
Ontario has been closed the longest for schools. Other provinces have been able to keep their schools open. And one of the arguments that the premier made at the press conference was that because that we are a big province. Caroline, in your view, why have most other provinces been able to keep their schools open?
I think it's been a priority to keep schools open. We've heard through this entire pandemic the sentiment that schools should be the first to open, the last to close. And other provinces have done that. Even Alberta, that closed their schools for 2 weeks and then reopened right after. Nova Scotia, just a few weeks ago, said that it was closing schools through the end of the year, and kids would learn online. But then did not reverse. The cases went down, and the lockdown or whatever they did worked, and so kids have now returned to the classroom. I think there is a priority because there's an understanding that kids need that connection with their teachers and their connection with their classmates, and being in the classroom is good for kids. It's hard for students to learn online all day. It's hard for them to sit in front of a computer. And I think other provinces have recognized that it's important that kids be in the classroom with their teacher for whatever time is left in the school year.
Stephen Lecce, the Minister of Education, we did try to get him on the program, but unfortunately we were told that there's no time to accommodate that. Kristin, your newspaper reported this week that Stephen Lecce, the Education Minister, was promising schools were safe since last November, but medical experts at Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children were less certain. Can you give us the story behind that?
So this was based on work by two of my colleagues, Rachel Mendelson and Jenny Yang, and they did some Freedom of Information requests to see, what was going on last fall. Schools have been shut down from March to June, and kids returned in September. And, at that time, cases were lower, and Stephen Lecce and David Williams, they were saying schools were safe, not a big source of transmission. And that's been their message consistently all along. So in and around November, there was a meeting. And I guess at that point in time, there was not a lot of definitive data on it. They were saying, are schools safe? We don't know. Numbers were still low at that point, and the messaging still was schools were safe. Maybe that was based on other jurisdictions' experience, and also the fact that there didn't seem to be huge amounts of transmission, although there were several outbreaks. So I think at that time they were saying schools were safe. They didn't really have the data to back it up.
And also, I think when sorry, Caroline, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in, Nam. I think, throughout this pandemic, one of the questions has always been, are schools safe? Researchers have been debating this, educators have been debating this, public health officials have been weighing in on this. And I don't think we can really answer that question, because I think the consensus is that schools are a reflection of what's happening in the community. And different jurisdictions have implemented different health measures and safety measures in schools. So there may be masking from kindergarten up here, and that may not be the case elsewhere. There's cohorting here, that may not be the case elsewhere. So I don't think, even with research studies, it's hard to determine sort of if it can be applied elsewhere. And I think, that question of, are schools safe? Well, I mean, we are in a pandemic. There are cases in the community, so there's going to be cases in schools inevitably.
And I think one of the, it came out maybe in December, because in COVID time, what is the month? And the suggestion was made that not enough testing was being done in schools to know if there were cases, because some of them could be asymptomatic. Kristin, when he was telling everybody that schools were safe, was this more about political posturing than anything else?
I believe what he was saying was based on what he was hearing from David Williams. And he was saying, I think his famous number was 99% of students had not been infected with COVID, COVID-free. That had been his consistent messaging, was that it was 90% plus, that everything was safe. Interestingly enough, when Premier Ford did send out his letter seeking consensus from all education stakeholders on whether to reopen schools or not, there was something in there that said, and this was new information, that schools were the biggest source of outbreaks in the month preceding April 20th. That came as a surprise. I think it was more than workplaces and everything else. And these were elementary schools. High schools were somewhat better. So that did come as a surprise. I think people didn't realize that. And it's certainly not something that was ever told to reporters and to the public at large. So were schools safe? I mean, in general, I think you could say some research has shown there wasn't a lot of transmission, but once you have the community numbers, as Caroline mentioned, it does come into schools. And I think that's why we saw the science table also predict that should students return, there could be an increase. And I think the Premier said about 2,000 to 4,000 cases.
Caroline, you actually asked the premier if his government had misled the public about the safety of schools. What did he say?
He said, well, his response was no. He said that the new variants are taking hold, especially the new Delta variant, and there was concern about that. So I understand, Nam, that the science is changing, the science is evolving. I understand that there are new variants coming, and we have to be aware of that. So the premier's response was he hadn't misled the public, that schools were safe. But as Chris said, there was that letter that he sent to public health officials and medical officers of health and, teacher unions that said that schools were a large source of outbreaks. And so that kind of, you just sort of juxtapose that with what he said previously, that schools were safe. You have questions around that now.
Going back to schools again, we've been hearing a lot. The government did announce that they were giving additional funding of $31 million, I believe, to help kids with mental health. We've been hearing a lot about that being one of the primary reasons why kids should go back to school. Caroline, what impact has remote learning had on children's mental health?
I mean, we have to remember, Nam, that about roughly a quarter of Ontario students chose remote learning back in September, or families chose remote learning back in September. So there have been a huge number of kids that have been doing it all along. We're starting to hear, I mean, being online is so difficult for 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds. And we're starting to hear about kids sort of just disengaged, turning it off, having meltdowns at home, not being able to do this. And we're getting sort of a picture of learning loss among kids, especially young kids who are, you learn the fundamentals of reading in these early grades. And we're starting to hear that kids are disengaged from learning. I spoke with an attendance counselor up in Thunder Bay a month or so ago about what he's seeing. And remember, Thunder Bay schools have been closed longer than schools in Toronto and Peel. They've been closed since March. And, he has families that have completely disengaged from education. And it's just so difficult right now. And I think educators are starting to worry about September and starting to worry about what kids, with varying education levels. I mean, you always have summer learning loss. There's always that coming into the picture, but with varying education levels coming into the school system, and what is being done, if anything, to help mitigate those learning losses. I think that is now a growing worry for educators, especially in Ontario, where kids have been in and out of online learning throughout the academic year.
Kristin, do we know if the government is planning on addressing that learning loss?
So they have pledged some money for summer learning, for math, and a little bit for tutoring. What we are seeing from other jurisdictions, though, is much more comprehensive plans, especially around addressing the learning loss. In the UK, they're looking at adding 30 minutes a day to the school day, hiring tutors. I think Quebec and BC have also talked about hiring tutors to help students. Because if you look at it, I mean, I think in the Netherlands and over in the UK, they've looked at about 2 months learning loss. That's how far kids are behind. And with Ontario kids having been out for so much longer, I mean, by the end of June, they'll have been out for 26 weeks over the course of the pandemic. That's a long time. So 2 months learning loss. The Toronto District School Board, which is the country's largest board, did a look at the learning loss. They found that kids in grade 1 were about 3 percentage points behind in reading. High school students had held pretty steady, but if they were already vulnerable or already struggling, they were struggling more so. Caroline also mentioned the issue of absenteeism, and there's also the issue of ghosting, right? Which is where kids log on, right? They kind of sign in, say that they're there, and then the camera's off, and then they're not taking part in school. So there is that whole issue of disengagement that I know schools are concerned about, and that they are going to have to address in some form in the fall.
I
And
think
I
I know
know
2 people who do that in my household. But Caroline, go ahead.
well, I hope mine are paying attention, but who knows sometimes. But, there are educators who are calling for reviewing the Ontario curriculum, reviewing the kindergarten to right up to grade 12 if you have to, reviewing the curriculum to make sure that there's some sort of scaffolding that happens at the beginning of the year next year to sort of, know where kids are at from the previous grade. And that needs to be done now. That needs to be done early enough. And there hasn't been any movement to do anything like that. There has been money, as Chris said, to pledge to remediation, to summer learning, but those are dollars sent to school boards, right? And they have to figure it out, which they will, I'm sure, but there's no provincial plan around this. And I think that's what educators especially and researchers are calling for, some sort of provincial initiative to address these issues.
And Kristin, a Financial Accountability Office report recently found that the province is $12 billion short in its education spending plan. We've been hearing from the government saying that they've invested more money than anyone else. What does that mean for students going forward if there is a $12 billion short in its education spending plan?
So the report from the FAO did say that it was 12 billion short. That's over the next decade, and they're looking at what the government is planning on spending versus what they think they will spend, looking at inflation, looking at salaries and things like that. Because it's costed out over the next decade, I mean, we have an election next year and another one before that happens, so we could have a change of government a couple of times. So, I mean, we can look at the numbers that way, but there's also concern that there's not enough funding there to even cover inflation. That's something we've heard from the unions, and that's something we've also heard from the opposition critics. Initially, boards were told they weren't getting any extra COVID money. Now they are. The government's pledged about $1.6 billion to help with COVID funding, and boards are allowed to spend about half of it because we're just going to see how things progress throughout the year, so that we will see things like improved ventilation, and it's for personal protective equipment and things like that.
I have about a minute left, and I wanted to just get from you, maybe 30 seconds from each of you. You speak to parents. We've been talking about this, kids upstairs and everything. Moving forward to September, what do you think is the thing that's top of mind for parents? Caroline, I'll start with you.
I think parents want their children in school. I think as normal as a year that we can give them after a year of disruptions, I think parents just want everything in place so that their kids can be in school in September. Parents have taken on the role of teacher as parent, and they just want their kids to be happy and in the school system.
And Kristin?
Yes, I mean, definitely want to return to normal as we can. I think a lot of things we hear also from parents and students is they want extracurriculars. They want their clubs, they want their sports, which have obviously been curtailed this year. They want their grads, they want their proms. So those are kind of the things that they're looking for, and that connectedness with their school.
Kristin and Caroline, thank you so much. And thank you for all the terrific work you've been doing through this pandemic. We really do appreciate your insights.
Thank you, Nam.
Thanks, Nam.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.